Hello and welcome to Archetype Builds. This is a behind the builds video about the Knight in Shining Armor, the video that came out last week. This is part of my first three videos where I'm really trying to hit the basics of fantasy archetypes, and then we're gonna kind of branch out into what I'm really excited about, which is some weird kind of off genre archetypes that you see in fantasy that don't have straight analogs in D&D mechanics. And part of the challenge really with the Knight in Shining Armor is it's a little bit too easy to do in D&D. I feel like most beginning players can, kind of identify the fighter subclass and kind of select basic weapons and armor that are required in order to, present as a knight. And a lot of, what makes a knight, like from actual medieval history, a knight is just backstory, right? It's like title and like I trained here under this king, and a lot of that it has nothing to do with the mechanics of the build. So, I was a little nervous about going into it and saying, well, people are going to want to play a knight, and there's no, there's things like the Eldritch Knight or the Echo Knight, but there's no just like knight class. And so I do think this is a useful addition to the channel to just have this out here and say, for a lot of people they fantasize about playing a knight, and this is going to serve that purpose well. And I think the build ended up, by going paladin instead of fighter, might introduce a new player to things that they wouldn't ordinarily have wanted, right? There's some amount of spellcasting, but that spellcasting is very optional, it's very passive, it's kind of low scale. I think even, a lot of my builds I like to go through all the different spells that you choose, and for this I did not, because I recommended just kind of throwing that onto smites when you have a particularly good hit. So I think it's a really good toe dip into the mechanics of spellcasting, and the number of peripheral benefits are pretty significant, right? The Aura of Protection is so good. That Lay on Hands just to have available as like an emergency is just so useful. And so I think I gravitated towards Paladin first to spice up the build, to make it a little more interesting, so that it's offering something that just a kind of basic naive view of the classes wouldn't give you. But secondly, I do think that it is better. Right? Fighter as a class, when you talk about like what makes a fighter unique as a class, you've got an expanded list of fighting styles to choose from. You've got a pretty long list of subclasses, each with a very different flavor. And then you've got that 6th level extra feat, right? Which means, rivaling the Warlock, the fighter is the most customizable class, right? It's not, a lot of people will point to like the champion fighter and be like, this is the most basic, class, subclass in the game. This is the like default, right? This is the vanilla. And I actually think that the reason it's vanilla is because the build is such a straightforward build. It's such a straightforward, like, passively increase your critical chance and your strength and your damage. But it doesn't have to be. Fighter is extremely modular. But Paladin is actually aimed directly at this concept of a like valiant frontline protector with some amount of passive party bonus. And I think that really applies to the Shining Knight, in the sense that I think the archetype, when you look at examples in fantasy, it is a leadership oriented archetype. It is someone who works with a group, fights in an army, and they are the kind of the beacon that leads that army into battle. And so in most kind of relevant examples, that extra charisma and those kind of party-wide bonuses were really relevant. And I think, obviously, for new players, there's nothing as satisfying as adding a smite on and seeing all those extra d8s stack up and doing this massive hit with your sword. But the combination of the armor and the defensive fighting style, getting that AC up really high, was good, and I always knew I wanted to do that with this build. The passive party buffs was really good, and what I started to recognize was, if you've watched any other optimization channels, you probably are aware that there's an issue with tanking which I think is actually a little bit, in my experience, it's a little bit overblown. If you are kind of the one martial character who runs up to the front and attacks the enemy head on, typically speaking, I think most DMs will attack you. And it's kind of a horseshoe, right? The really bad DMs won't have any other strategy, so they'll just go for what's simple in front of them and easy. And this is, I kind of think, how most people think of their tank classes. And this does exist. I think this is real. But on the other side of it, really good DMs will recognize that that's the character that you are playing. Like, you're playing a protector, you're playing a tank, and part of the fantasy for you is taking a dozen hits and 11 of them miss, and just that feeling of like being overwhelmingly difficult to hit and take down. And so I think really good DMs will allow that to happen. It's really at this kind of the crux of the horseshoe, where a DM has gotten wise enough to learn tactics, but not wise enough to know that they are on the player's team, right? So oppositional DMs will see you on when you're 21 AC and just ignore you, leave you alone, take the opportunity attacks, and have everyone run back and attack the casters, and that's kind of a bummer. So a lot of other optimization channels make big hay about the ability to drive attacks towards you, and paladins do have a few ways to do this, but their ways to do it are, I think, in my opinion, are a little unsatisfactory given our armor class. So, Redemption has that aura that allows you to substitute yourself for an attack, but you can't reduce the damage. So then it's like, I want to interpose myself with my armor on and my shield and everything, right? I want to be leveraging that armor in my protection of my allies. Redemption doesn't let you do that. Crown has the same thing. Crown, at least, is going to have the Channel Divinity to challenge someone, which is pretty good, and you can always get the spell Compelled to Duel, which is nice, and I like it. The reason I didn't take it on the build is because I actually think if there's a situation where there's one enemy, if you have a good DM, or again, if you're on one of those pigs of the horseshoe, that you should be allowed to just challenge them to a duel. And the spell always frustrated me a little bit because you have to expend this resource to essentially make the DM's decision for them to attack you and fight. And one, robs the DM of the ability to play that scene the way that they want to, but two, robs you of a spell slot when really, in many situations, you should be able to just challenge that person to a duel, and be like, winner takes all, whatever, and then you in your 21 AC, and you're very difficult to hit, and that person is fighting you, and maybe your allies have some amount of support they're lending, but it could be this incredible moment that I think you can just, through roleplay, through normal play of the game, you can have that. So I didn't choose any of the kind of paladin mechanics for being a tank because I don't like any one of them. But there is obviously a fighter mechanic that is extremely good for it. So when I was kind of thinking about the build and thinking about, well, do I keep going Paladin 7? Aura is pretty weak. Paladin 8, that's just a feat. Paladin 9, 10, it was pretty lame. So I was looking to get out of Paladin, and fighter presented itself again. So I kind of looped back around to it because of this Cavalier Mark ability. And you get this kind of bonus to horse riding that I think is appropriate for the character as well. I think when you visualize the Knight in Shining Armor, I think maybe they ride in on a horse, but you can easily look up examples of jousting knights, knights on horseback, and having the flexibility, especially around that level. Level 9 is right when you're running mid-tier, your kind of upper mid-tier levels of play, and you are now able to do things with a horse that you might have been riding around the entire time. You're able to do things in battle that are much more interesting. So I like that as an escalation of your options and your play style. It's not just adding numbers on, it's actually adding new dimensions to the battlefield, which I think if you're a new player and you're coming in and you've played for 8 levels, you're probably ready for that. You're ready to have new doorways open up. So Cavalier just seems so perfect. It gelled really well with everything else. And you do get that taunt mechanic that is sort of mechanically sound, right? You hit someone and then they have a real mechanical disadvantage, so you're protecting your allies if they attack them, and you're protecting their allies if they attack you. So it's this win-win situation. It only works on, I believe, right, when you hit someone, so you're kind of limited in your own attacks. But you do have that action surge. You do have kind of ways of making sure that you can tag a particular enemy. So I think it was, yeah, looking back on the build, I think it's worth doing. The Knight in Shining Armor was worth putting together a video for. The options that we have available might not have been intuitive, which is exactly what we're looking to do on this channel. We're looking to find the value where other people might not necessarily find it. We avoided kind of some boring character creation, right, like the champion fighter or even the Oath of Crown all the way or something like that. And I think we put together a pretty interesting build here. So one of the things I also want to note here is it's actually harder to find examples of this archetype in media than I expected. Certainly, there were no perfect examples. A lot of the stuff that I was looking for, obviously the Knight in Shining Armor is a trope, right? It refers to someone who comes in and rescues someone, and in the act of rescuing seems heroic and glorious, right? That's a Knight in Shining Armor, and it can be used derogatorily to refer to someone who is essentially chasing that glory. They're sort of saving someone not to save them, but to look good for themselves. So obviously, like, that is another connotation of that particular phrase, and that was really common, right? When you go to like examples of Knight in Shining Armor, like it's all that across Google. So examples of knights was mostly like Game of Thrones, or I used a lot of clips from Merlin as well, which was surprising to me because obviously that's just one show set in medieval times, but really it had some of the best like knights, like fantasy knights, like Gallant, Code of Honor knights, and of course that beautiful example of a smite that I didn't expect to find when I was looking for examples. But I don't think there are that many cases of a like charismatic, heavy plate armor wearing knight, and so maybe hit me up in the comments with your favorite example of this archetype. I would love to see more, and maybe the process for creating these videos is always evolving, right? So we're going to be doing stuff with the backdrop soon. We are going to be changing some of our equipment, getting new audio equipment, and so maybe one day I will go back and I'll redo some of these videos, and I'll use your examples in the comments below. If you can give me some good ones, I would love that. So that's it for me. I will be back next week with another build video. We have a few that have basically, I've filmed a bunch of them, and they just need a little bit of editing to be ready to go. So hopefully we'll be able to hit a couple of videos right in a row, a couple of builds right in a row in the next couple weeks. Thanks, guys.